On the last episode, we talked about the final years of Marcus Aurelius' life, and I promised that we would get into his views on Stoicism and his journal of personal meditations, which still survives to this day. As we'll see today, the meditations offer an amazing and quite unique insight into the mind of a man that ruled Rome, and this at a time of great upheaval and transition. It was the end of Rome's golden age. And Marcus Aurelius was not just an eyewitness, he was a crucial player. What was going through his mind as the world was crumbling around him? We'll talk about that on this episode of the Pax Romana podcast. Episode 54, The Golden Age Ends. As we saw last time, Marcus Aurelius in his final years was presiding over an empire that was increasingly becoming exhausted. And Marcus himself, at least in his body, was slowing down. He had fought illness his entire life, and it's clear that he was about to die by the time we get to the late 170s. One of the things that impresses me about Marcus as a leader is that it must have been tempting during these years to mail it in, to push the difficulties of the age onto future generations, and to just engage in the kind of recklessness, especially economically, that we will see within just a decade or so. But he doesn't. For example, Marcus's soldiers continued to demand more and more money from the emperor. And if you've been listening to the past few episodes of this podcast, you can understand the soldiers' argument. They were fighting a war that seemed impossible to win. It was ugly. It was in the forests across the Danube. It was not profitable. The men that were fighting were not necessarily Rome's best soldiers. Some of them were gladiators and former slaves and criminals. They weren't really there for glory. They just wanted money and stability, and Marcus was not giving them a pay increase. We're told in a speech that Marcus gave to his soldiers, and it was recorded or perhaps embellished by the Roman senator Cassius Dio, who lived through this time, that Marcus was completely unwilling to compromise with his soldiers. Marcus evidently said that whatever the soldiers obtained above their regular pay would be wrung from the blood of their parents and their kinsmen. That's Cassius Dio's Roman History, Book 72. In other words, Marcus could very well have said, look, I'm not going to live much longer anyway. Who cares if I borrow a bit of money or tax a bit of money or debase the currency a bit so that I can pay my soldiers' salaries and secure a year or two of peace and maybe a bit more security. After all, as we saw last time, Marcus had already faced a full-on usurpation from his top general. It made sense for him to go ahead and spend money on the soldiers. Later emperors will do this. We will see this in the podcast as we look at the period just following the Pax Romana. These warlord emperors that will rise up are more than happy to tax and debase and even pillage the Roman Empire to ensure that the soldiers are given regular pay increases. Marcus, however, held firm, and it probably made the last few years of his life much harder. I don't know if it ever occurred to him that he was not going to live to see the end of the Marcomannic War, that this conflict that was just supposed to last a year or so and was meant to be a quick and overwhelming Roman victory had now drug on for a decade. Marcus made the best of that difficult time by penning his meditations. Historians have a variety of views about Marcus's meditations, which are, as I said at the end of the last episode, a set of notes that Marcus wrote to himself. They don't appear to have been meant for publication, and they appear to have been written in the last years of Marcus's life during a period which, again, as we've seen from this podcast, was very difficult for Marcus personally and also for the empire itself, which he was responsible for. We call this collection of personal notes the Meditations, but Marcus actually did not give this collection this title. Again, he probably did not wish to publish it. For some people, Marcus's meditations are incredibly profound. They are a great source of Stoic wisdom, and I'll say a little more about what Stoicism is in just a second, at least what ancient Stoicism was. For others, they're just a version of ancient pop psychology. I'm sure that some listeners have heard, for example, of Mary Beard, arguably the most or one of the most prominent ancient historians at the moment. Mary Beard, she is at Cambridge. She's written numerous books. I don't know Mary Beard personally, but she had this to say about the Meditations. She says, quote, "The Meditations of Marcus Aurelius is the worst sort of platitudinous self-help manual. Always think of the future. We don't need a Roman emperor to tell us that." On the other hand, you have folks like, say, Ryan Holiday, who has created this Daily Stoic podcast and YouTube channel and a set of books, and he's very, very successful. He had me on his show earlier this year. Again, I don't know him personally, but for Ryan Holiday, the Meditations are some of the most profound writings in existence, and he has invested himself and really designed his life around ways of applying some of these private notes that Marcus wrote to modern life. And he has a very favorable view of Marcus Aurelius as a result. I would argue an almost hagiographic perspective on Marcus Aurelius. It is definitely true that Marcus was some kind of Stoic philosopher, and his Meditations reflect that. And I also think that this philosophy, to the extent that Marcus held to it, really helps him personally. Stoicism comes from the idea of the stoa, and the stoa is the porch. It is the place in the ancient Greek house where philosophers would chat. Stoicism is effectively porchism. It's talking about philosophy on the porch. Stoicism had become very popular in the Roman Empire several decades ahead of Marcus's reign. In fact, Marcus was probably living just after the waxing of Stoicism's influence in the Roman elite. And it's clear that Marcus adopted many of the main tenets of Stoicism. For example, Stoics believed that people should think logically about the world as it is, to understand the world without prejudice, to not let understanding be clouded by a desire or a pursuit of pleasure or a fear of pain, that these kinds of base appetites or aversions should not cloud our ability to judge the world as we find it, as it is. This idea, when applied personally, as Marcus was clearly trying to do with his Meditations, led to a common set of tendencies in a Stoic's daily life. Self-control, for example, was highly prized by Stoics and by Marcus Aurelius. Self-control enables a person to reason and to understand the world, to see the ways in which the world is governed by reason. The basic belief here from a religious perspective is that the gods have arranged a reasonable world. And so the purpose of life is to move toward this underlying DNA of reason in the world. And growth in personal character and virtue was, in effect, aligning oneself with this divine spirit of reason. Stoicism is about not living life haphazardly. That's the way that children live. They live passively, governed by emotions and appetites and aversions. And Stoics aren't meant to eliminate emotions. That's a common misconception. But they are to have an inner calm and a sobriety, which gives them clarity about their emotions and their desires and their aversions, and therefore enables the Stoic to govern those emotions, because that's about the only thing that a person can govern. They can't really control the world. They have to basically trust that the gods are running things. What they can do is govern that part of the world that is themselves, that is within the realm of their control. And so if everybody, or if many people, would then live a reasoned life, we would see a more harmonious world, and humanity can focus on a kind of collective pursuit whether they know that they're doing it or not, towards reason and contentment. There's more to ancient Stoicism than that, but I think that's a pretty good summary, at least from the Meditations, of what Marcus saw as Stoicism. And I will say, I do think it's up in the air. Not whether Marcus was a Stoic. He clearly was, at minimum, Stoic adjacent. But was he just a dabbler? Was he a Stoic in the same way that, say, many professional athletes are Christians? They don't go to church. In fact, if you're a professional athlete, you probably play a sport on the day that you should go to church and you never go. You honor God by doing pointing a finger up to the sky when you score a touchdown or hit a home run, but you probably don't have a lot of time to, say, read the Bible. But I think many professional athletes who engage in these sorts of habits would still identify themselves as a Christian. And many people in society would identify those people as Christians. To what extent is Marcus's Stoicism like that? It's actually tough to say. It's clear that he understands basic ideas from Stoicism. But unfortunately, we lack a kind of definitive sense of what orthodox, if I can use that word. I probably can't. I should probably use a different word other than orthodox. But what considered disciplined Stoic philosophy was, we simply don't have the evidence available to tell us exactly what that was. So in turn, we don't really know the extent to which people like Marcus Aurelius and perhaps someone like Seneca, who was a senator under Nero, we don't know the extent to which they were, I guess, what we might call hardcore Stoics. But what I think we can say is that Marcus Aurelius was wise. I do think he was wise. And I don't know the extent to which he was a good Stoic, but whatever philosophy it was that he espoused, it clearly gave him practical help to deal with a world that was rapidly falling apart. And you can get a sense from his Meditations, which I recommend you read. It's not very long. You can get a sense from those of exactly what was on his mind. One of the most common themes in the Meditations is death. Marcus was thinking a lot about dying, and especially how to be of good character when facing death. For example, in Book 2 of the Meditations, this is what Marcus says: "Even if you were destined to live 3,000 years or 10 times that long, nevertheless remember that no one loses any life other than the one he lives, or lives any life other than the one he loses. It follows that the longest and the shortest lives are brought to the same state. The present moment is equal for all, so what is passing is equal also. The loss, therefore, turns out to be the merest fragment of time. No one can lose either the past or the future. How could anyone be deprived of what he does not possess? It is only the present moment of which either stands to be deprived. And if indeed this is all he has, he cannot lose what he does not have." That's Book 2 of the Meditations. Marcus believed that fate should be accepted with dignity and with purpose. And so death, when it happens, is not actually a tremendous loss, because all of the past years that one has lived, however long they are already gone. The past was gone before one died. The only thing of the past that we retain is our thinking about it, is our memories in the present, that we're enjoying in the present instead of some other thing. In other words, even when we die, we just lose the present moment. We also don't lose the future, because the future isn't there yet anyway. And the future can only be experienced in the present moment. Right now, in the present, if I'm thinking about the future, I'm imagining what it might be, but that imagining is taking place in the present. So again, I'm not actually losing the future. If I die right now, I'm still just losing the present. And even if I were to live those future years and maybe enjoy them, the moment that I died in some later time, I would still not necessarily be dying with those future events. I would just be dying with the memory of those events, which is no better than I am right now in terms of dying with the memory of the past events that have already happened to me. And so because death is effectively the same for everybody, it's the loss of the ability to experience the moment, we shouldn't necessarily be afraid of it, and we should be able to face it with courage. Marcus can arrive at conclusions like these because he values sobriety. And that gets back to the Stoic idea of neither chasing after pleasure nor avoiding pain. And earlier in the Meditations, in the first book, when Marcus is praising various people who had an influence on him, he speaks of his adoptive father, Antoninus Pius, as exhibiting this sobriety. He says that Antoninus Pius had, quote, an immovable adherence to decisions made after full consideration, no vain taste for so-called honors, stamina and perseverance, a ready ear for anyone with any proposal for the common good, and he rewarded impartially, giving everyone their due. Marcus saw the previous emperor as living consistent with this common spirit of rationality, not living according to popular opinion, not caring about the praise of people who, by the way, have poor judgment because they're trying to flatter and praise people, but rather living in a sober way, and also really an authentic way, living a principled life in accordance with the spirit of rationality that exists in the world and inside of all human beings to a certain extent. He talks about Antoninus Pius living without pretense and self-importance and pursuing after so-called honors. Marcus did not wish to do things simply to please others, and that goes back to the soldiers. The soldiers wanted money. It would have made them happy for Marcus to just give them money. And it wouldn't have cost Marcus anything anyway because he was going to die soon. Somebody else would have had to deal with the fallout. And yet, Marcus held firm. Later in the Meditations, in Book 3, he explains why he thinks this way. He says to himself, quote, never regard as a benefit to yourself anything which will force you at some point to break your faith or to leave integrity behind, or to hate or suspect or to curse another, to dissemble or covet anything needing the secrecy of walls or drapes. A man who has put first his own mind and divinity and worships the supremacy of the God within him makes no drama of his life, no hand-wringing, no craving for solitude or crowds. Most of all, his will be a life of neither pursuit nor avoidance, and it is of no remote concern to him whether he will retain the bodily envelope of his soul for longer or shorter of time. That's in Book 3 of Marcus's Meditations. I think one of the reasons why Marcus is remembered as a good emperor, especially by members of the Senate, was because he had a disposition to allow criticism. He, of course, was the emperor, so there was a certain amount of pomp involved in that. But if these meditations actually reflect the type of life he tried to live, Marcus must have listened often to people around him and made changes based on what he heard. He wanted clearly to be approachable, not just as an affectation or as a style, but he actually wanted people to talk to him, to share with him their opinions on how things were going and what they needed. Didn't mean that he was going to give in, especially if it violated his sense of integrity and his sense of rightness, again, with the soldiers, for example. But I think what we see in the Meditations, which this is just a small sampling, shows an emperor that was very thoughtful and I think quite wise. So whether he was a Stoic or not, even if we can't know this, I think we can know what Marcus's goals were. It's really unique to get insight into someone's thinking like we have here, especially into the thinking of a Roman emperor, and a Roman emperor who lived at a time when things really were falling apart. By the year 180, this is the last year of Marcus's life, soldiers were cranky. His son Commodus had finally come of age, and it was a good thing too because Marcus was getting very weak. The Marcomannic War had burst open again, and Marcus was once again sick. Marcus's death is a strange one. We have two sources that are fairly close to events. One is Cassius Dio, the Roman senator. The other is the Greek historian Herodian, who was very young when Marcus died, but he nevertheless was alive, and he collected information in the decades after Marcus died. Both of our sources mention that Marcus became sick, and that this sickness was expected to kill him. When Marcus's soldiers were told of this sickness, they expected him to die. Cassius Dio, our best source, claims that there may have even been foul play, that Marcus was sick, but that his doctors may very well have been making him worse, and this on purpose. Cassius Dio suspects that Marcus's son, Commodus, was hoping Marcus would die, and that the doctors were trying to curry favor from the man who was going to be emperor. We don't have Marcus's final words, but there are two passages from ancient sources that I think are appropriate to note when we think of Marcus and his death. The first is from Herodian, who in his history of the Roman Empire begins with the death of Marcus Aurelius. This is what he says in Book 1 of his history. When Marcus suspected that there was little hope of his recovery and realized that his son would become emperor while still very young, he was afraid that the undisciplined youth, deprived of parental advice, might neglect his excellent studies and good habits and turn to drinking and debauchery when he had absolute and unrestrained power. This learned man was disturbed also by the memory of those who had become sole rulers in their youth. That's Herodian, Book 1. Marcus himself, however, does not give a sense of any of this worry in his meditations. That's not saying he wasn't concerned about Commodus, but Marcus was probably thinking about his own character in facing death, especially during his final days. This is what he says, for example, near the end of the Meditations, in Book 9. It would have been the mark of a better and wiser man to depart from the human race without having had any taste of falsehood, pretense, luxury, and pride. But the next best course is to breathe your last when you have at least become sated with such things. Or do you prefer to settle down with vice, and has experience not yet persuaded you to flee from this pestilence? For corruption of the mind is a far graver pestilence than any comparable disturbance and alteration in the air that surrounds us. For the one is a plague to living creatures as mere animals, and the other to human beings in their nature as human beings. Do not despise death, but welcome it gladly, for this too is among the things that nature wishes. It's interesting, this is the only mention of pestilence in the entirety of the Meditations. We don't know if the Antonine Plague was still raging at this time. I happen to think that it was mostly gone, but it still had ravaged the empire for maybe a decade. It had probably killed people that Marcus knew, and he himself seemed to be quite afraid of it when it came to Aquileia. And yet in this instance, he uses pestilence in order to say that actually much worse than a biological pestilence is a pestilence in the mind, the pestilence of vanity, the pestilence of lying, pestilence of pride, that a man can die happy knowing that he has abandoned these things, at least by the time that he dies. And so on March 17th, AD 180, Marcus's body gave out and the emperor did die. And in his place, whether he got there by murdering his father or not, rose Marcus's son, Commodus. We'll say more about Commodus in the next episode of the Pax Roman podcast, but for now, I want to leave you with the assessment of this transitional moment in Roman history as given by the Roman senator Cassius Dio. Because for Cassius Dio, the empire changing hands from Marcus to Commodus was more than just a change in emperor. It was a change in age. Something ended with Marcus Aurelius, and something new began with Commodus. This is what he says. I admire Marcus Aurelius for this reason, that amid unusual and extraordinary difficulties, he survived himself and he preserved the empire. But one thing kept him from being completely happy, namely that after rearing and educating his son in the best possible way, Marcus was vastly disappointed in him. And this matter is our next topic, for our history now descends from an age of gold to one of iron and rust.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exocor. Follow Professor Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.